Hello everyone, I always get so nervous. You can't really tell, but pretty big flames, so I'm always just watching it, fear that one's gonna fall. And hello everyone, hope you're doing well and staying safe. I can't believe we're already in the second half of January and I'm finally getting around to filming this, but I'm glad I waited because a couple of my favorite books I read right at the end of December. Today I'm gonna be ranking, not actually in really any particular order, my top 5 books that I read this year. I'm gonna also talk about my least favorite book of the year, which if you've been watching my channel this year, you can probably guess. And then also my author of the year for who I read the most books by. I'm already reading more in 2021. I can tell a lot faster than I did in 2020, so let me know if you have any recommendations and I'll add them to my list. First is What Alice Forgot, and I had previously read, what was it, Big Little Lies, and adored that, so this is my second book that I've read by her. I read this, I think, 2 days before the year ended, so again, glad I waited to film this until January. But I was reading a list from someone who's read all of Liane Moriarty's books, and they're rank ordering which ones they thought were best, and they thought What Alice Forgot, was their #1 book by her. This is about a woman named Alice, of course, who she's 39 years old, hits her head while working out at the gym, and when she wakes up, she has the mindset and all the memories of only from when she was 29 years old, recently married and pregnant with her first child. So it is horrifying to her when she wakes up in a 39-year-old body. She's got multiple kids. Her marriage is not in the state that it used to be. You find all of this very early in the book. I should have said at the beginning, there'll be no spoilers mentioned, of course, for any of these. What I've heard people say who've read a lot of her books, or all of them, is this is a much more condensed book than a lot of her other stories. For example, what is it called? I was gonna read 9 Perfect Strangers and I started and got a little bit bored, and what I just heard from people was this has a lot less going on than a lot of her other books, but in a weird way that's kind of a good thing. I do think that when it comes to contemporary fiction, nothing related to horror or thrillers, Liane Moriarty is quickly becoming one of my favorite authors. I just find her writing so interesting and witty, her characters feel so realistic, and I also highly recommend the audiobooks because the narrator has an Australian accent, which is great. The only con I'll say about this, because I will briefly mention what I didn't like about each book as well, of course, was just that I thought after all the build-up, the ending went a little too fast and was a little bit too rushed, but overall I really enjoyed this one. Next is The Good House by Tanara Reeve Dew. What I'm about to say is not a spoiler because it happens very early on in the book, and you'll see it in any, Goodreads quick summary online, but this is about a mother whose son dies by suicide right at the beginning of the book. He's a teenager. This happens at sort of this remote home that's been in their family for generations. After it happens, she goes back, really focuses on just work and forgetting about that house, but she quickly realizes that she needs to return to really come to terms and maybe try and understand exactly what it is that happened. This is such an interesting, beautiful, sort of fantastical take on a haunted house story. It's also told from different perspectives, hers, her son's, her relatives, her ex-husband, so it also is on top of that just this sweeping saga. And I have to say, out of all the 5 books that I'm listing here today, and I think, although this is my opinion, and I also think in my opinion it's an objective fact, this is easily the most well-written book out of any book on this list. The only con is there were some characters' POVs that I wasn't incredibly interested in, so the book sometimes felt a little bit too long for my taste. But again, if you enjoy ghost stories, if you enjoy horror, if you like just well-written books, even if you're not normally a fan of horror, this book, quite frankly, just took my breath away in a lot of ways throughout a lot of moments in the book. So I think if there's really honestly one book from this list you should check out for maybe an author you haven't heard of before or read a book by before, it is The Good House. Next was a surprise to me when I was thinking about my favorite books. I was almost surprised that this made it onto the list, almost because I just hadn't even heard of this book before this year. And that is 12 Nights at Rotterhouse. Similar to The Good House, this is also a haunted house story, but very different. It's about Felix. He is an author who is not making a lot of money, and his sort of last ditch effort is to rent out this house, I think it's called the Rotterdam Mansion, for 13 nights, live in it for 13 days, 13 nights, no contact to the outside world, and record everything that happens. And he's hoping that he can write a nonfiction book about his experiences afterwards, and that this will maybe be finally be that runaway hit that will earn him some money and make him famous. I forget off the top of my head what his friend's name is, but his friend ends up staying with him, so there's a lot of themes about friendship and family and relationships as well. But I think what made this book so fun was the fact that, one, it is incredibly scary. I would say that this is probably, maybe this and The Good House would be tied for scariest book on this list, but it's also incredibly meta because it's about, you know, an author and his friend who are both really interested in horror books and movies, and so there are a lot of references just about the genre, about even specifically haunted house genres, because they're trying to kind of do things that would normally happen in a haunted house book or movie. So just, I think if there's a book you're gonna read, if you're sort of just a horror fan, a true horror fan, I think that this book is incredibly fun. My only con, and this will not be a surprise to anyone who's read it because I think a lot of us feel this way, I thought the ending was a little bit cheesy, but that's just me. Then is a book that I think was my most anticipated read of 2020, so I'm really happy it made it up into my top 5, and that is Mexican Gothic. This takes place in 1950s Mexico, and Noemi receives a letter from her cousin who's been recently married, and her cousin tells her, "My husband is poisoning me, all these horrible things are happening at this house." And so Noemi picks up and goes out to investigate and see what happened to this remote mansion in the countryside in Mexico, to this weird, very bizarre family. There was just something about this book that I flew through. I could be wrong because I can't remember. I read this really early on in 2020, but I think I read this within like 24 to 48 hours, which for me is very fast. And one thing that was too bad about this book was it was the first book I read on my Kindle. And because of that, I think I just kind of thought, oh, well, maybe I just like read really fast on a Kindle. No, it was just the fact that I just thought this book was a ton of fun. And maybe fun is a weird way to describe this book because a lot of really horrific, horrifying, really disgusting and weird things happen, especially towards the end of this book. But this book was just such, again, I keep using the word fun, which sounds silly to describe it, but it was just such a thrill, such an entertaining ride. And if you want just a bizarre and weird, you know, take on Gothic fiction, I think that this is just a blast. And finally, and this will come as no surprise, and I should have said before, I've got full reviews of most of these books on my channel, so you can just search for those. But my final favorite of 2020 was the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. This has been a rough year for all of us, of course. So when I've thought about my favorites, I'm sort of leaning maybe a little bit towards ones that are more maybe fun than my traditional favorites, but I've just needed a lot of levity and entertainment in my books in comparison to other reading years. This is sort of Dracula meets Desperate Housewives in 1980s Georgia. Patricia is a mom in the suburbs with 2 children and a pretty crappy husband, and a neighbor named, what's his name? James Harris moves next door, and at first she kind of likes him and thinks he's interesting and great, and then very quickly, as especially children go missing, she starts to get some bad vibes. I thought it was really sweet that the author said he kind of wrote this for his mom, because I think he lived in that area and with his mom in the 1980s, so it was kind of an ode to her and her book club and friends. But this book had just everything I needed in it this year. Obviously, I love horror. I needed some funny entertainment. The first 10 pages of this book just had me outright laughing, which is really rare. But just a warning, if you haven't read this, the majority of this book is not funny. It gets really dark and disturbing, incredibly graphic, especially by the end. I've heard that this has been picked up by, I think it's Amazon Prime, to become a movie or a TV show, and I'm not surprised at all. And again, I don't think this is a perfect book by any means, but it's just exactly what I needed by 2020. And if you've read any other books by him you'd recommend, definitely let me know. Okay, so now we're gonna get into my least favorite book of the year. And I should say that normally I would do one video on my favorite books and another video on my least favorite books, but one thing I've been really focused on this year is DNFing books I'm not enjoying, just because, you know, 2020, 2021, I'm not gonna spend time not enjoying a book. But for whatever reason, I kept reading Ninth House, and I absolutely despised it. I feel terrible if my friend who's watching, who recommended it to me, is watching this video. But in your defense for recommending it, a lot of people really love this book. I have a whole video explaining why I didn't like it, so feel free to go watch that rant review. But for me, it was also a disappointment because Leigh Bardugo is such sort of a big hit among, I guess, in the whole book world, but especially it feels like in BookTube and on BookTok and all that. And this was the first and only book I've read by her, so left a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth, but let me know, do you think I would like her other books? Yes, no, I don't know. For this next category, I don't know if I would call it top author because I wouldn't say she's necessarily my favorite author of all time, but I was surprised when looking back on my reading year that I had read 3 books by the same author for the first time I'd ever read books by her, and that was Ruth Ware. So I read The Woman in Cabin 10, Death of Mrs. Westaway, and Turn of the Key. And I have to say, one of the main reasons I picked these up was because they were always available as audiobooks on the Libby app, and they're just good books for me to have on in the background as I'm driving, cleaning my house, falling asleep. There's something about her books where I wouldn't say they're, you know, my favorite mysteries or thrillers of all time, but there's something just very quiet and cozy about them, which was really nice this year when I just needed to calm down. All of her characters are kind of around my age. The protagonist also tends to either be like stuck on a boat, stuck in a big house trapped, so it's kind of just fitting that that a lot of us are trapped at our homes this year. So there was just something very cozy that I connected to, and it was just always a really pleasant experience. If I had to rank them, I'd probably say maybe Turn of the Key, Death of Mrs. Westaway, and then Woman in Cabin 10. I honestly did not enjoy Woman in Cabin 10 much at all, but I thought Death of Mrs. Westaway and Turn of the Key were both really enjoyable. I've heard really bad things about In a Dark Dark Wood, so I don't have too much of a desire to pick up that one, but if you've read any other books by her you would recommend, definitely let me know. And let me know, because I don't, in general, complete books I'm not enjoying anymore, should I occasionally do videos on all the books I've DNF'd? Because a lot of them are ones that are somewhat popular that maybe you're wondering, why haven't I read and reviewed this yet? And it's because I started it and didn't like it. So let me know if occasionally you'd like me to just do DNF videos. So those were my favorites and least favorites of 2020. I haven't decided if I'm gonna do a 2021 TBR or what my goals are for 2021, but I will say I'm reading a lot more than normal, at least so far, so it's been a good reading year, at least for the first month. Please let me know if there are any other books, again, you'd like me to read in 2021. My next video will be finally filming the video on public speaking that a lot of you have been asking for. So again, hopefully you guys are doing well and staying safe, and I'll see you next week. Bye.